Gandalf's resurrection, Frodo's sacrifice, Aragorn's kingship. J.R.R. Tolkien always insisted that The Lord of the Rings was not an allegory, but at the same time he called it a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. So what does that mean? Beneath the mythical magic of Middle-earth lie biblical threads weaving an intricate tapestry of faith. A faith Tolkien never wanted to preach, but always held close to his heart. So today, let's break down the Christian symbolism within the world of Tolkien. Before we get into this, I want to acknowledge that my interpretation of The Lord of the Rings is clearly not the only interpretation. Tolkien strongly opposed a singular interpretation being imposed upon his work. He wanted to write a story that could be universally enjoyed, regardless of background or beliefs. So even though Tolkien intended many Christian themes throughout his work, he likely intended other meanings as well. Secular or spiritual, your interpretation is just as valid as mine or anyone else's. But for our purposes here, we'll be viewing Middle-earth through the Christianity of its creator. To fully grasp Tolkien's stories, it helps to understand the man himself. Tolkien grew up captivated by stories and nature, often escaping into internal fantasy worlds with his younger brother. But his early life was marked by tragedy, losing his father at only 3 years old and his mother at 12. After his mother's conversion to Catholicism and her early death, the now orphaned Ronald Tolkien and his brother were placed under the guardianship of Father Francis Morgan, a Catholic priest who oversaw their upbringing. While boarding at a house arranged under his guardianship, Tolkien met fellow orphan Edith Bratt, who would later become his wife. The faith instilled in him by his mother and safeguarded by Father Morgan would shape the rest of his life. After attending Oxford, Tolkien served as a second lieutenant in the British Army, surviving the brutal trench warfare of World War I. Trench fever is what would release him from a landscape of craters dug by a constant barrage of artillery shells and brimming with mud and corpses. And through it all, his faith sustained him. Tolkien returned home to heal, both mentally and physically, marry his sweetheart, and begin teaching at his alma mater. There at Oxford, he met several good friends who shared his lifelong obsession with mythology and fantasy, or what they called fairy stories. At the time, these fantastical genres were primarily geared toward children. They were seen as too silly and immature for respectable adults. But Tolkien was lucky enough to find a small group of fellow weirdos who loved myths and fairy stories as much as he did. This group dubbed themselves the Inklings. Cute name, by the way. And they met together every week for years to come. At these meetings, they discussed mythology, storytelling, religion, and read their own writings to each other, followed by critiques. This group of fanboys was as geeky as modern-day Comic-Con, except with more tweed and tea, and less of whatever this is. C.S. Lewis, who as we know would become the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, was among this small group of Inklings. Tolkien and Lewis's friendship was the backbone of the whole group. They were nearly inseparable for about 20 years. Lewis was one of only 3 people whom Tolkien allowed to read the unpublished draft of Lord of the Rings. Each even wrote characters that were based on the other into their stories as little inside jokes. Treebeard being based on Lewis, and Professor Kirk being based on Tolkien. I just want to pause here and point out the insane coincidence that 2 of the most famous writers of the 20th century just happened to be best friends before they found success. What are the odds? But in reality, it wasn't coincidence at all. Though their writing styles were very different, they'd be the first to admit that it was the influence, friendship, and encouragement of the other that helped them blossom into the incredible authors they became. I firmly believe without Tolkien, we'd never have Lewis, and without Lewis, we'd never have Tolkien. Their relationship is such a strong testament to the power of good friends. Of these 2 world-famous friends, we often think of C.S. Lewis as the religious one. After all, he became one of the greatest Christian writers of the 20th century. But he wasn't always a Christian. In fact, when Tolkien first met him, Lewis was an atheist. So who converted the great Christian apologist C.S. Lewis? Well, there were several factors to Lewis's conversion, but Tolkien was no small piece of the puzzle. He and Lewis discussed faith regularly. Tolkien, who had dedicated his life to studying and creating myths, believed that the reason we feel so deeply about stories filled with heroes, gut-wrenching sacrifice, triumph against the odds, and happily ever afters was because they all echoed the ultimate story, the gospel of Jesus Christ.
I cannot believe something I do not understand. How can the life and death of someone else, whoever he was, 2,000 years ago, help us in the here and now?
When you meet a god sacrificing himself in a pagan story like Dionysus, Balder, Osiris, or even in a fairy tale, you like it very much and are mysteriously moved by it, provided you meet it anywhere except in the Gospels. Well, the story of Christ is a myth, working on us in the same way as other myths, with one tremendous difference in that it really happened.
Suddenly, a rush of wind interrupted us, startling me. So many leaves fell to the ground, I thought it was raining. I held my breath.
I don't know if Tollers remembered that moment. I did. His words hit home. No matter how unwilling, I was beginning to move.
Literary scholar Alan Jacobs said, Lewis became a Christian not through accepting a particular set of arguments, but through learning to read a story the right way. Tolkien helped Lewis do just that. He said, "We have come from God, and inevitably the myths woven by us, though they contain error, will also reflect a splintered fragment of the true light, the eternal truth that is with God." Tolkien convinced Lewis that every timeless, universal, transcendent story has impact for one significant reason. They speak to our soul's yearning for Christ. He considered his work to be sub-creation, or creating imaginary worlds inside the physical world. God created the real world, and we, created in his likeness, inherit that same creative spirit. Exercising this desire to create is both natural, as offspring of God, and a sacred way to honor him through emulation. C.S. Lewis didn't convert to Tolkien's specific denomination, but he certainly took Christianity and ran with it. He skillfully translated complex doctrine into more understandable and approachable language, creating a vast and influential library of Christian apologetics, and we have Tolkien in large part to thank for that. And that brings us back to Tolkien himself, and one of the most common misconceptions about his work. As previously mentioned, Tolkien hated allegories, and some have interpreted this to mean he intended no Christian themes in his stories at all. But I think this is a misunderstanding of what he actually meant by allegory. When it comes to allegories, we think of stories that rely on symbolic, analogical representations to illustrate a specific message or moral truth. One example that comes to mind is C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, with the lion Aslan being an allegory for Jesus Christ. In fact, when you Google examples of allegories in literature, the Chronicles of Narnia is one of the top results. So, would it surprise you to learn that Lewis himself did not consider his story to be an allegory? He said, "The Narnian books are not so much allegory as supposal. Suppose there were a Narnian world, and it, like ours, needed redemption. What kind of incarnation and passion might Christ be supposed to undergo there? If Aslan represented the immaterial deity in the same way in which Giant Despair, a character in The Pilgrim's Progress, represents despair, he would be an allegorical figure. In reality, however, he is an invention giving an imaginary answer to the question, what might Christ become like if there really were a world like Narnia? And he chose to be incarnate and die and rise again in that world as he actually has done in ours. This is not allegory at all." The distinction is subtle, but it was significant to Lewis. So if Lewis, Tolkien's contemporary and close friend, did not consider Narnia to be an allegory, then perhaps both Oxford scholars had a narrower definition of allegory than we do. Tolkien seemed to define allegory as not a loose metaphorical interpretation, but a one-for-one, shot-for-shot depiction of another story or event. He disliked the rigidity of that kind of storytelling, because it restricted imagination. Tolkien preferred the meaning in his stories to develop more naturally, focusing on the experience first rather than the message. It's also important to note the context of Tolkien's denial of allegory in his stories. In every recorded instance, it came in response to the claim that The Lord of the Rings was an allegory about the war. In the mid-1960s, when The Lord of the Rings was taking off in popularity, many readers began to wonder if Tolkien intended the One Ring to represent the atomic bomb. They saw Sauron as Hitler, Mordor as Nazi Germany, and the War of the Ring as World War II. Tolkien was adamant that this was not the case. Certainly Tolkien's contemporary world and his personal experiences in war influenced his writing, but his story was not written as a direct allegory for the war. It's not that he opposed individual readers seeing parallels in his work. Personal interpretation is always allowed, but his vision for Lord of the Rings was broader than retelling a single, albeit momentous, event in human history. Though Tolkien felt the term allegory was too restrictive for his artistic scope, his dislike of allegories didn't mean he hated all symbolic meaning. Quite the opposite. Tolkien's love of myths from all over the world stemmed from the idea of universal spiritual substance, that stories remind us of truths we already know on some deep level, but pull those truths to the surface, like a dream organizing our waking thoughts into familiar symbols while we're unconscious. Lord of the Rings is packed with this kind of symbolism, not to impose a moral lesson upon us, but to awaken or affirm the yearnings of our hearts. The way I see it is that Lord of the Rings is less like a Sunday school teacher trying to dictate new information, and more like an encouraging companion, walking alongside you on the same spiritual path, one who listens to your experiences and validates them, comforting you in difficult times and reminding you of the faith you already have within you. That gentle Christian influence was no accident. Tolkien said, "The Lord of the Rings is of course a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision." As a fiction writer myself, I think it's impossible to completely conceal our deepest beliefs in our work. So it makes perfect sense to me that Tolkien's faith colored his stories unconsciously. However, according to his own words, he took it one step further by making a conscious effort to lean into his faith. Now, I'm not Catholic and I'm definitely no expert, but even for those of us with limited knowledge of the faith, there's some clear Catholic influence all over Lord of the Rings. For example, Galadriel can be seen as a representation for the Mother Mary, specifically from the Catholic perspective. She's said to be the greatest of elven women, a parallel to Mary being the greatest saint. Our characters speak to and about her in a reverent, almost worshipful manner, and her name is often invoked during times of trouble, followed by divine intervention. Lembas bread seems to symbolize the Eucharist. Towards the end of The Return of the King, we read, "The lembas had a virtue without which they would long ago have lain down to die. It did not satisfy desire, and at times Sam's mind was filled with memories of food, and the longing for simple bread and meats. And yet, this way bread of the elves had a potency that increased as travelers relied on it alone, and did not mingle it with other foods. It fed the will, and it gave strength to endure, and to master sinew and limb beyond the measure of mortal kind." Like the Eucharist, lembas appears to be nothing more than ordinary bread, but it holds a veiled power within. It's most potent when it's set apart, not mingled with other food, reminding us of the fasting Catholics do before communion. And it didn't satisfy hunger, that's not the point. The point of the lembas and Eucharist is to give strength to endure, a strength that can't be found from mortal sources. Not to mention, lembas was made by Galadriel's people, underscoring the idea that our Mary figure is the source of the bread of life. Could Ithilien, the beautiful yet contested land between Gondor and Mordor and protected by Faramir's men, represent a type of purgatory? It's simultaneously a place of divinity and hope, as well as contention and danger. It's not the final home for our characters, but a necessary passage, a testing ground, a preparatory haven between realms. During their Ithilien stay, Sam and Frodo found an abundance of asphodel flowers, elegant but spiky and fibrous perennials. The asphodel meadows in Greek mythology are a neutral space between Elysium and Tartarus, heaven and hell. Greek, Norse, Finnish, and Anglo-Saxon mythology, among others, laid a lot of linguistic ground that Christianity populated, so to speak. Some have interpreted the presence of pagan inventions, such as dwarves, elves, and wizards, to mean the story itself is pagan.
I've heard people try to make the argument that Lord of the Rings is overtly Christian, And I hate to burst the bubble, guys, but you're just wrong. There's nothing overtly Christian about Lord of the Rings. There's no church in it. There's no faith in it. There's no Christ figure. There's none of these things. And honestly, Lord of the Rings, if it's anything, Lord of the Rings is overtly pagan.
But this couldn't be further from the truth. It's like calling Christmas trees pagan simply because of their origins, ignoring how their meaning has evolved. Evergreens symbolizing eternal life, lights representing the light of the world, the star or angel announcing Christ's birth, and the gifts reflecting both the Magi and Christ's gift of salvation. The reality is, symbols change with human interpretation. It's the meaning we give them that matters. So while Lord of the Rings draws on pagan imagery and legend for inspiration, its meaning tells a Christian story. It's the constant underlying thread. Tolkien once received a letter from a man who described himself as an unbeliever, or at best a man of belatedly and dimly dawning religious feeling. He too noticed this ever-present faith. He said, Tolkien created a world in which some faith seems to be everywhere without a visible source, like a light from an invisible lamp. Tolkien responded, if sanctity inhabits his work or as a pervading light illumines it, then it does not come from him, but through him, and neither of you would perceive it in these terms unless it was with you also. In other words, Tolkien acknowledged the possibility of faith within his work, but only for those with eyes to see. Countless more Christian symbols not exclusive to Catholicism fill the pages. For instance, the Shire could easily represent the Garden of Eden. It's the genesis of our story. We read in The Return of the King that no murders had ever taken place in the Shire, symbolizing a sanctuary spared from sin and death. It's a land of innocence and abundance, known for its fertile soil, untroubled lifestyle, and inhabitants ignorant to external protectors shielding it from harm. Zooming out, have you ever thought about why it's called Middle Earth in the first place? If you're anything like me, you probably assumed it was just a way of indicating the story was an alternative history of the real-life Middle Ages. Or perhaps you assumed it had to do with the placement of the land. Middle Earth is a continent between two large bodies of water, making it literally Earth in the middle of the map. All of this is true, but there's actually another potential reason for the name. It stems from a poem called Christ One, from which Tolkien actually discovered the name Middle Earth, as well as the word Erendel, the inspiration for the Silmarillion character and the light Galadriel bestows on Frodo. In this Christian Anglo-Saxon poem from about the 8th century, it expounds on Christ's advent, his incarnation, and praises Christ as the divine light and savior. It also refers to Erendel, coming from the heaven above the Midanyard, or the Middle Earth, which is specified as the inhabited world of men. The idea was that there was a heaven above and a hell beneath. This makes the earth, or the inhabited world of men, in between those two realms. Middle Earth is just another way of saying the world between heaven and hell. Have you ever thought about the significance of the date the Fellowship left Rivendell on their journey to Mount Doom? It was December 25th, and the day the ring was finally destroyed, March 25th. Tolkien rarely emphasized specific dates in his narrative, so their placement feels intentional. December 25th is, of course, traditionally observed as the birth of Christ, and March 25th has long been associated in Christian tradition with the Annunciation, and in some older reckonings, even the Crucifixion. Positioned within the wider Easter season, when we celebrate Christ's resurrection, these dates perfectly bookend this Christian quest. The One Ring, the primary object of trouble, can be a symbol for temptations, and Sauron, its master, is of course a stand-in for Satan. Sauron originated as a Maya, or a powerful divine spirit, before the creation of Middle-earth, and he became corrupted, essentially making him a fallen angel, much like Lucifer. Sauron became the personification of evil, irredeemable, power-hungry, a figure who cannot create, as that's a divine power, but can only destroy or corrupt, for instance, producing orcs by corrupting elves or men. The defeat of this Satan figure comes as a result of miracles, or eucatastrophes. A eucatastrophe is a term Tolkien coined, meaning a moment in a story in which all hope seems lost, but an unlikely redemption occurs. Some examples include the return of Gandalf after apparently losing his life to the Balrog, the cavalry of Rohan finally arriving to aid Gondor in battle, the eagles flying in to rescue Frodo and Sam, Gollum stealing the ring, but in that act, accidentally destroying it. These are all eucatastrophes, life-saving miracles that defy the odds. Tolkien believed the ultimate real-life eucatastrophe was the resurrection of Christ, and he echoed that eucatastrophe throughout his stories. Considering all the Christian symbolism throughout his work, the bottom line is that Tolkien's denial of allegory does not equal a denial of Christianity. So we've gone over some Christianity in Lord of the Rings so far, but perhaps you've noticed a gaping hole in this perspective. In fact, we're missing the main component of a Christian story, a Christ figure. C.S. Lewis made his Christ figure obvious in Aslan, but who is the Tolkien equivalent of Aslan? Some say there isn't one. But I believe there's not just one, but potentially several. Instead of squeezing every divine attribute into one singular character, Tolkien split Christ's different characteristics into 3 primary characters, and I'll tell you about them in the next video. Surprise! This is just an introduction to a series on Christianity in Lord of the Rings. So if you want more, please remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Thanks so much for watching. Please let me know in the comments what you agreed with and where I went wrong. I'll see you next time.